Now to turn to our speaker today, Mikhail Sergeev. We were just joking about his biography. This is actually only half of it because it doesn't include his publications. I'm a great admirer of Mikhail's work, his attention to philosophy, his deep understanding of things, and how much he enjoys teaching as well. He was born and raised in Moscow, attended the university there, got his bachelor's degree there, came to the United States, and then pursued his master's and doctoral degrees at Temple University in Philadelphia. He now teaches there in Philadelphia at the University of the Arts, and he's also one of the co-chairs of our Department of Religion, Philosophy, and Theology. He's also on the faculty of Temple University. So he has done really quite a lot of academic work, and not to mention all of his publications, which there was no room to include here today. And like I said, today he will be talking about comparative views of the afterlife, and we're looking forward to hearing that. So Mikhail, welcome to our webinar today, and thank you for presenting. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
So I will begin my presentation about comparative visions of the afterlife. That will be a comparative presentation based on the history of religions, and more specifically on my course that is called Afterlife. Now, before I begin, I want you to look at this great Christian painting, one of the Christian paintings that depict the Last Judgment. It is based on the book of Revelation in the Bible. The painting is divided into two parts. On the top, you see the Christian depiction of heaven with Jesus at the center. And at the bottom, you see the depiction of Christian hell with the Archangel Michael at the center. The Archangel Michael is portrayed with a balance scale because according to the Christian tradition, the Archangel Michael will decide who is going to hell and who is going to heaven. And depending upon your sins or good deeds, and that should be placed on the scale, Michael will allow you to either go up or down. Yes, I always like the paintings that depict Archangel Michael because he is my favorite biblical angel, the angel of the apocalypse, and my namesake. So now let me begin with some introductory observations about the idea of afterlife. Why is it that afterlife, the topic of afterlife, is of great interest to us humans? In my view, we all are born with the basic existential condition. And this existential condition is such that on the one hand, we are fully aware of our own mortality. And on the other hand, we have no direct knowledge about what awaits us after death. Now, animals are in better position because they do not have full awareness of death. And angels, who according to Christian theology do not have a free will and can only do God's bidding, they have knowledge of everything, including the spiritual world. The world of humanity is in between. And this in-betweenness produces a deep-seated psychological and emotional anxiety and suffering, whether we are conscious of it or not. Now, science cannot offer any solution to this anxiety. So therefore, religion seems to be the only instrument of relieving this anxiety. And this is one of the reasons why religion will never die. I was born and raised in the Soviet Union, and I was taught there that religion will be extinct in time because it is based on the exploitation of classes. But the real need that religion fulfills, in my view, is to alleviate the deep-seated anxiety of humans about their future after death. So therefore, no religion, whether Eastern or Western, ancient or modern, could dispense with the notion of salvation and the promise of eternal life. In fact, we know from the history of religions that there are religions without God, early Buddhism, for example, but there are no religions without the idea of salvation and the promise of eternal life. Different faiths promote this idea under various names, but names are different. The essence of the issue is the same. So if you talk about spiritual liberation, deliverance, enlightenment, self-realization, self-actualization, awakening, etc., salvation, it is basically the same thing. So that's why the concept of afterlife plays a truly unique and indispensable role in religious traditions that no other idea or belief could ever match, substitute, or challenge. Now, let us look at the history of human intellectual development back in ancient times. And if we look at the so-called Axial age, the time period roughly between 8th century BC and 4th century BC, when all the major philosophies and religions were conceived and developed in different parts of the world, then we will see that there is a certain number of basic concepts or ideas that have been developed at that time in various religious and philosophical systems. In fact, I would say the two concepts are of special significance: the idea of the impermanence of the world and the idea of moral retribution. Now, the idea of the impermanence of the world is not part of our discussion today, but we will be talking about moral retribution because the idea of retribution serves as the foundation for our ideas of heaven and hell. Heaven is the ultimate reward, and hell is the ultimate punishment. So let us look at various cultures and let us see this idea of retribution and how it played out in those ancient cultures. So first, Hinduism. The idea of retribution is one of the earliest and most popular ideas in Hinduism. In the Rig Veda, one of the scriptures, oldest scriptures of Hinduism, which scholars refer to the period between the 15th and the 12th centuries BC, we find the reference to the order of things, the cosmic law of unity and justice that underpins the existence of the universe. One of the gods of the Rig Veda, whose name is Varuna, is portrayed as the supporter of this order and the guarantor of human morality. Now, then later, the notion of moral law became the source of two fundamental concepts of Indian thought, dharma and karma. The idea of dharma included religious rules and ethical principles that define the life of the individual and the survival of the community. And the concept of karma, which literally meant action, and which was formulated in later versions of the Vedas and the Upanishads, is also connected with morality and ethics. One reads in Hindu scriptures that a person becomes kind from a good act and bad from an evil one. Now let's take a quick look at ancient China. In ancient China, during the Zhou dynasty, this is approximately between 12th and 8th century BC, there was a cult of Zhuang Tian Shan Ti, Supreme Lord of the mysterious or dark heavens. Tian was revered as the supreme deity of the dynasty, which is in charge of moral law. People believed that the emperor ruled his subjects by following the will or the mandate of heaven, Tianmin. Later, this belief found expression in the political doctrine of Confucianism. And according to the views of Confucius, who lived in the 6th century BC, the real might of the state is in the moral character of its leader. When the ruler loses the favor of heaven, he loses his subjects' trust and risks falling victim to a popular revolt or palace coup or revolution. Now, a couple of words about Egypt. In ancient Egypt, sages also taught about the eternal cosmic order established by the supreme God creator in the interest of truth and justice. They believed that this order, immutable to the entire universe, was based on the law of retribution, governed by the supreme deity Ma'at, who was portrayed as a winged female being. According to the ancient Egyptian theory of retribution, a wise and righteous deed leads to beneficial consequences, and in contrast, a foolish act leads to punishment and possibly to the perpetrator's destruction. And finally, we come to the Bible, the foundational book of our Western civilization. And when my students ask me what is the main idea that runs throughout the whole Bible, my response is always the idea of retribution. The idea of retribution runs throughout the whole Bible. It starts with Adam and Eve falling from divine grace, and it ends up with the apocalypse when, after the Armageddon, those who are still alive are being divided into two parts of humanity: those who enjoy eternal life and those who will suffer forever and ever with the false prophet and the devil in the lake of fire. So in the biblical tradition, retribution becomes fundamental. It runs through all the books of the Bible. It binds the Old and the New Testament together. Hebrew sages associate retribution primarily with people's behavior, whether they adhere to or deviate from religious and moral commandments. The biblical God reveals those commandments to people, which means that their retribution depends on how obedient they are to the divine teachings. Injustice and delusion inevitably lead to punishment, and faith and humility, on the other hand, are rewarded with blessing and salvation. And now let me move from a general discussion of the idea of retribution and divine reward and punishment to a more specific discussion of how this theory of retribution is playing out in the concepts of heaven and hell. Now, the case is that all religions, in some way or another, developed the theories about afterlife, and more specifically, heaven and hell. But those ideas about the afterlife are different, and they can basically be divided into three main concepts. The concept of reincarnation, according to which people, when they die, they come back to inhabit a different body. The idea of spiritual immortality, according to which when we die, our body deteriorates, but our spirit moves on to a life in the spiritual world. And the idea of bodily resurrection, which is peculiar to Christianity. And according to this idea, our spirit or our soul cannot live permanently without the body, and therefore the afterlife, the ultimate afterlife, necessarily requires bodily resurrection. So I will briefly discuss three versions of these visions of the afterlife. And the first one, the idea of reincarnation, will be illustrated by Buddhism. So spiritual traditions that have been originated in India, namely Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, advocate the idea of reincarnation. As I said, according to the doctrine of reincarnation, At the moment of death, our spiritual self leaves the body and based on the actions of past lives, returns to earth to inhabit another physical body. Some reincarnationists believe that we can be reincarnated in lower forms of life as insects or animals. Other reincarnationists believe that we can be reincarnated only as humans. But no matter what different schools of this religion believe, they have one general view about reincarnation and how it is related to the idea of the enlightenment or nirvana in Buddhist terms, and the ideas of heaven and hell. So please take a quick look at the picture on your right. So you will see here a nice guy, the god of death, Yama, who is holding a will, the so-called will of dependent origination. The will of dependent origination in the Indian tradition is called samsara, which is the will of birth and rebirth. While you are within this will, it means that you will be reincarnated again and again, and you will not be able to achieve enlightenment. Now, in Buddhist terms, enlightenment or nirvana equals Christian heaven or paradise. However, if you look at this will, you will see 6 realms of existence. The top realm is the realm of gods, then clockwise the realm of titans, who are against gods, then the realm of hungry ghosts, who can never satisfy their various appetites. At the bottom realm is the realm of Buddhist hell, then upward the animal realm, and finally the human realm. Now, there are some Buddhists who may take this 6 realms of existence literally and claim that human beings can be reincarnated in different forms of life. I personally take this part of the will symbolically and simply take it as an illustration of various ways humans can live their lives. They can live like gods, being wealthy, powerful. They can live like titans, which means that they always struggle to get power. So if Republicans are on top, then Democrats are the titans. If the Democrats are on top, Republicans are the titans. Then hungry ghosts are people who live by their desires, whether sexual, emotional, physical, or even intellectual. And finally, the bottom realm is the Buddhist hell. And the idea of hell in Buddhism is the mirror. The symbol of hell is the mirror, because hell means obsession with oneself, self-obsession. So if you look, by the way, to finish this brief description, the animal realm is the metaphor for the survival of the fittest. That's what animals do. They eat each other. So nowadays, we would probably call it free market economy. And finally, the human realm illustrates the fact that humans are more than just, people who satisfy their desires for power, for wealth, for anything else, for self-enjoyment, and for economic prosperity, that humans are born to be enlightened. So the bottom line is that we may take the top and the bottom realm of the will as Buddhist heaven and hell. And if we do that, we may be correct, but we have to remember that in this case, Buddhist hell and Buddhist heaven are not like Christian heaven and hell, because they are not permanent. There is nothing permanent within the will of samsara. If you are so unlucky that you are born in the bottom realm, it means that you have to exhaust a lot of sins, but in the end, you will be reborn in higher realms. The same with the top realm. The top realm seems like paradise, but it is not permanent, and therefore it is not paradise per se. No matter how good is your karma, you will exhaust it and you will move down. So strictly speaking, if we compare Buddhist heaven with the Christian heaven, the Buddhist heaven is the idea of nirvana, moving beyond the will of samsara, having no karma and not being reincarnated at all. As I say, Christians want to be born again, while Buddhists do not want to be born again. Because being born again in this realm of life means that we have not learned our lessons. Not being born means that this is finally over and we are moving on. So nirvana is the true heaven in Buddhism. Now, a couple of words about Abrahamic religions. In contrast to Indian-born spiritual traditions, the monotheistic religions of Abrahamic root, Rabbinic Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, teach that after death, the human soul goes through divine judgment and as a result moves to its spiritual dwelling, either in paradise or the inferno. And here we have the difference between Christianity on the one hand and Islam and Judaism on the other. Traditional Christians believe that, following the example of Jesus, in due time they will also experience bodily resurrection. And after the last judgment, their transformed, spiritualized bodies will inhabit the kingdom of heaven. The followers of Judaism and Islam, in their turn, deny the bodily resurrection of Jesus and argue that after death, the human soul will lead a purely spiritual existence, either in the realm of eternal bliss or everlasting damnation. And now from this general description of the ideas of reincarnation, spiritual immortality, and bodily resurrection, we move more specifically to Christianity, because it is in Christianity that we have the doctrines of heaven and hell to have been fully developed. But it is important to note and to take into consideration that when we are talking about Christianity, we have to distinguish between the three main branches of this religion: Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Protestantism. And each one of those three branches emphasizes different versions of the afterlife and of heaven and hell. So, for example, Orthodox Christianity. Most of my students in the universities and most of my viewers usually know a lot about Catholicism and Protestantism, but do not have enough knowledge about Orthodoxy, because Orthodoxy, although it is present in the United States, is not established as well as those other forms of Christianity. At the same time, interestingly enough, Orthodox Christian beliefs about the afterlife are very different from the Catholic beliefs and the Protestant beliefs, and are very similar to what Baha'is believe about the afterlife. For example, Orthodox Christianity teaches that paradise and hell do not exist from God's point of view, but they exist only from man's point of view. It is a subject of man's choice and condition. So heaven and hell are not real places, established places. They are simply viewed as heaven and hell from the perspective of human subjectivity. Heaven and hell then are not physical places in which we spend all eternity, but rather an actual state of being when we encounter the Almighty God of consuming fire and love, which either causes us to withdraw within ourselves or to reach out and be healed. So if we withdraw, that's what Orthodox people call hell. This is a personal state of the spirit or of mind. If we reach out and are healed by God, this is what Orthodox Christians are called by heaven. And as states of being, heaven and hell begin in this life and continue in the world to come. Now, some quick observations about Catholicism and then Protestantism. And I'm pretty sure my viewers are more familiar with Catholic and Protestant, beliefs about heaven, hell, and the afterlife. Still, it's interesting to see what Catholics believed in the Middle Ages, and St. Thomas Aquinas, most probably the greatest theologian and philosopher of the Catholic Church of all times, gives us a very detailed description of heaven, hell, and all other aspects of afterlife existence in his magnum opus, Summa of Theology. In this work, St. Thomas Aquinas distinguishes between heaven, hell, and the Purgatory. Now, the Purgatory is the unique creation of the Catholics. In the days of early Christianity, Christians believed that when someone is baptized, this person becomes a totally new creation. So therefore, they distinguish between non-Christians and Christians. Non-Christians are sinners, therefore they cannot go to heaven. Christians are represent a new creation, therefore they go to heaven. But when time went on, they realized that there are Christians who are not such good people. So they realized that even if you are baptized, you can go to hell, like we read in Dante in his famous poem Divine Comedy. But what should be done to people who are baptized and therefore can go to heaven, but who are sinners, but not as sinful as to go to hell? So the answer was the Purgatory. The Purgatory is this transitional state in which a person could expiate his or her sins, not mortal sins, but venial sins, and then move up to heaven. Another interesting ideas about medieval Catholic understanding of hell is the idea of limbo. St. Thomas Aquinas is talking about two limbos, the limbo of the father or Abraham's bosom, and the limbo of children. Now, the limbo of children, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, was reserved for those children who were not baptized. What if a child is born and, after several minutes, the child dies? He dies unbaptized. So according to the Catholic dogma, being unbaptized, this child is not, will not be accepted into heaven. However, this is an innocent child, and it would be unjust to place him in hell. So therefore, the limbo of children, where children live in a separate section of hell, which is not as hellish as the rest of hell. As far as I know, Catholics nowadays do not believe in the limbo of children. This doctrine was reinterpreted. And the limbo of the fathers was that section of hell that was reserved for the great people of the old, like Moses and Old Testament prophets and the heroes of the biblical faith, who simply could not have been eligible for heaven because they lived before Jesus and they were not baptized. So therefore, they were placed, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, to the limbo of the fathers. But when Jesus dies, if you remember the Gospels, first he descends into hell. And this descent into hell symbolizes his ability to open the limbo of the fathers and to save those Old Testament heroes and to take them with him into heaven. So as far as I know, Catholics still believe in the limbo of the fathers, but it is empty because Jesus saved all those souls. Now, a couple of words about Protestantism. It is usually assumed that Protestantism as a movement started with Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the church of the cathedral in the town of Wittenberg. On the left side, you see this cathedral today. And that is true, formally speaking. However, the seed of Protestantism, in fact, lies in Martin Luther's personal psychological condition. He suffered from depression. He was a Christian, a devout Christian. He was a monk. He was a professor of biblical exegesis. He taught his students the Bible. So he did everything he should have done as a good Christian. And in spite of that, he was not certain about his own salvation. And that led him to depression. Nowadays, if you suffer from depression, you go to a counselor, to a psychologist, to a psychiatrist. Back then, you overcome this crisis in different ways. So the way Martin Luther overcame his crisis was to reinterpret one specific sentence from one of the letters of the Apostle Paul. And the sentence from Romans chapter 1, verse 17 said, the just shall live by faith. So in traditional Catholic theology, that was understood in terms of retribution. So if you live well, you will be rewarded. But if you are a sinner, you will be punished. Martin Luther looked inside himself and saw a sinful soul. So that's why he was not certain about salvation, but his personal salvation. But he reinterpreted the sentence, the just shall live by faith. He reinterpreted the idea of justice, not as a way of divine judgment, but he reinterpreted divine justice as God's justification through faith. So according to his new teaching, it is not about reward and punishment. God's grace comes to us by mysterious God's choice. And God's grace could be expressed only through personal faith. And if you have this faith, and Martin Luther was pretty sure that he was a faithful person, then it meant that God's grace visited you and you are predestined to salvation. That's how Martin Luther overcame his personal crisis, and that's how the idea of predestination for salvation or damnation became the starting point and the cornerstone of the Reformation theology. However, if you take the ideas of heaven and hell, the Protestant idea of predestination, and all those kinds of ideas, literally, if you think about them in a reasonable way, you will come to various paradoxes about heaven and hell. And it is not surprising, I think, that since the beginning of Christianity, there have been theologians who actually rejected the idea of hell altogether. For example, Origen, or Origen in Greek, his name is pronounced as Origen, the third century Christian theologian, taught the idea of apokatastasis, meaning eternal salvation, that everyone in the long run will be saved, and even the devil, I'm paraphrasing another Christian theologian, even the devil will take the bait of Christ and will repent. But the idea of universal heaven did not became very popular in Christianity. In fact, it became a heresy. So hence, those people who proclaimed heaven for everybody and who are known as universalists, universal heaven, did create their own Christian denomination later on. So why the ideas of heaven and hell as they were taught in classical Christianity were so questionable? So here are some of the paradoxes of heaven and hell. The first one. So the notion of eternal suffering in hell appears to be incompatible with the belief in the omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent God. In fact, how can a finite human being be deserving an infinite punishment from an all-loving creator? And that seems to be a very strong argument, because if we look at our own families, so let's say I'm a father and I have a son. So will I put my son, who is 2 years old, in such a position that he may harm himself? Will I give him a knife with which he could kill himself? Never. And if I love my son to the point of making everything in my power, making everything so that he is secure, the omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent God surely would do the same for his creation. The second paradox. The ideas of heaven and hell, in fact, seem to be incompatible with each other. So this is the reasoning behind that statement. Let's suppose that I am predestined to heaven, and my son or my wife or my mother are predestined to hell. What kind of heaven would it be for me? Of course, it would not be heaven, because I will commiserate. Any person having compassion and loving his parents or spouses or children will suffer in heaven because of the fate of their loved ones. So therefore, if we extend this idea to everyone, to every human being who ever lived, because as Jesus taught, we have to love our neighbors as ourselves, if at least one person is going to hell, it will be hell for everybody, including those who are in heaven. So therefore, if hell does exist, heaven does not. But if heaven exists, hell should not exist. If you are going to heaven and your loved ones end up in hell, your paradise also turns into a place of eternal damnation. Here is the third paradox. If God predestined some people to heaven and others to hell, and we cannot change our destiny, then what is the point of being a morally responsible person? What the hell? Let us enjoy ourselves, and whatever happens, happens. Now, there are other paradoxes of heaven and hell. Heaven and hell are contextual notions. It all depends on the context into which you put your understanding of heaven and hell. That's why, by the way, there are so many jokes and anecdotes about heaven and hell, and all of them are developing this idea of heaven and hell being contextual. All depends on the context. Just one quick joke to illustrate my point. A Protestant pastor dies and he ends up in hell. So he is a pious person, he accepts his fate, but he looks up and sees a bus driver who was always drunk and who ended up in heaven. So he feels injustice. He calls to St. Peter and says, look, St. Peter, I'm sorry, I understand I may be a sinner, but why the hell is this drunken bus driver, why the hell is he in heaven? And Saint Peter responds, look, I'm sorry, man, but when you were preaching your sermons in the church, everybody in the church was falling asleep. While when this bus driver was driving while drunk, everyone in the bus was praying. So you see here that the ideas of heaven and hell are very tricky and very multifaceted, I should say. And to take them literally will lead you to various paradoxes, logical paradoxes that are practically impossible to resolve. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that modern religions that have been developing since the 19th century, probably realizing the difficulty with those concepts of heaven and hell, proposed new solutions to the dilemma of the Christian afterlife. And in this last segment of my presentation, I will give you just 3 examples of this new approach to the idea of heaven and hell. The main feature of all these approaches is the same. Modern religious movements are trying to get rid of eternal hell, because the idea of eternal hell seems not to correlate with the belief in God, who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Our first case in point will be Mormonism. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a rather modern movement. We are talking about the first half of the 19th century. It is very successful. It has 6 million members in the United States, more than 16 million worldwide. It has its own scriptural texts, like the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine of the Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price, although Mormons also believe in the Bible. So they are trying to combine the Bible with their own scriptures, which is sometimes very difficult to do. Now, if you go to the Mormon temple, and usually if you are not Mormon, you are allowed to visit the Mormon temple before they are sanctified, before they are consecrated as temple. So there is one temple in Philadelphia. I visited the temple, I think a couple of years ago, and it was a very interesting tour, because the Mormon temple is designed very differently from traditional Christian churches. So one of the rooms in the temple, this one that you see on the slide, this room symbolizes the highest level of Mormon heaven. It is called the Celestial Room. So the Celestial Kingdom, according to Mormon beliefs, the Celestial Kingdom is the upper section of heaven that is reserved only for Mormons who completely obey the Mormon rules and norms, and who performed the so-called sealed marriages. There is a special room in the temple for sealed marriages. It is a special kind of marriage, divine marriage, that seal you with your spouse for all eternity. Now, there is the lower chamber of Mormon heaven. It is called the Terrestrial Kingdom. Now, the Terrestrial Kingdom is designed, according to Mormon belief, for everybody who did accept Jesus in this lifetime, or who will accept Jesus after they die. So for all good Christians, not necessarily Mormons, for all good Christians and good people. But there is the next section or chamber of Mormon heaven, the so-called Celestial Kingdom. And this kingdom is reserved for sinners. So it may seem like this is a Mormon purgatory, with the only difference that if you are in the celestial kingdom, you cannot get up. You cannot move on. You cannot expiate your sins. This is your dwelling place forever, but it is not hell. You know, it's still livable. And as for hell, Mormons call hell outer darkness. It does exist for the so-called sons of perdition, but according to Mormon teaching, only a few humans may end up there. And who ends up there? People who do the one and only unforgivable sin, according to the Bible, blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. Now, what is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit? That is another question, but the point is that most of the people who ever lived will end up in heaven, but in different levels of heaven. Now, the second case in point is Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses, this is another modern religious movement. It is not doing as, it is not as successful as Mormonism in terms of membership. Still, it has 8 million members around the world as of 2018. It went through tremendous expansion into foreign countries, and they have very peculiar beliefs about heaven, hell, Armageddon, apocalypse, and the afterlife. Now, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, they are a group of Bible students. So they are trying to reinterpret the Bible according to their own viewpoint. And the first interesting point that they make is that they believe that human beings were created physically eternal, but not spiritually immortal. So Adam and Eve had such physical bodies that they were perfect, and Adam and Eve would have lived forever. But because they've sinned, and Jehovah's Witnesses do believe in the original sin, the punishment for that sin was death, physical death. And since Adam and Eve were not spiritually immortal, you know, since this sin, every human being is simply mortal. When we die, we really cease to exist. Now, that seems to be contrary to classical Christianity, but as I said, modern religions are radically reformulating our ideas of heaven and hell in the direction of eliminating hell. So let us see how Jehovah's Witnesses do that. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe in the immortality of the soul, but they do believe in bodily resurrection, in two forms of bodily resurrection. The first one, spiritual rebirth. This one is confined to Christ and the anointed class of 144,000. That comes from the book of Revelation. And a physical restoration for the rest of us. So this is Jehovah's Witnesses heaven. Heaven has two sections, the spiritual section for Jesus and some anointed people, and the physical section for the rest of us. Now, according to Jehovah's Witnesses beliefs, the second advent of Jesus will initiate the millennial kingdom, which is described in the book of Revelation. And after the millennium, there will be the final trial and tribulation. So the idea is that 1,000 years is like a transitional period during which all those who are resurrected, all of us, will have a trial and a chance to accept Jesus. According to Jehovah's Witnesses beliefs, most people will accept Jesus, and only a handful of hardcore sinners will fight against God and will encounter hell. What is hell? Hell, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, is the second death that is described in the book of Revelation. And the second death is literal annihilation. So Jehovah's Witnesses basically reject the idea of hell in favor of literal annihilation. I'm not sure that this is a better version. I think both Both options suck, but it is still better. And finally, the third religion, Baha'i Faith, and the way Baha'i teachings also address the paradox of heaven and hell and resolve it in a very different way from Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, from classical Christianity, and from all other religions that we talked about. So number one, Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i Faith, explicitly and directly tells us that afterlife does exist, and after death, after the separation from the body, our soul will continue to progress until it attains the presence of God. However, his second point is that we do not know, and we could never know, we will never know, the nature of the soul after death. He says, I quote, "The nature of the soul after death can never be described, nor is it meet and permissible to reveal its whole character to the eyes of man," end quote. Why? Because, as Baha'u'llah says, you have here a quotation, but I will paraphrase, because if we knew what awaits us after death, some of us would rejoice to such an extent that we would commit suicide, and others will be full of fear, anger, and pain, because they will know what kind of punishment awaits them after death. So therefore, it is wiser not to disclose the afterlife. So basically, there are two reasons why we do not know exactly what awaits us after we die. Number one, because of the limitation of our knowledge. And number two, because it is too soon for us to know what is our destiny after we die. So the bottom line in the Baha'i approach toward heaven, hell, the afterlife, and also such concepts as resurrection, reincarnation, as I said, heaven, hell, divine judgment, etc., is that those concepts should be taken symbolically and not literally. That's how Baha'i teachings reinterpret traditional Christian and other ideas about heaven and hell. Since we have no direct knowledge of spiritual realities, when we are trying to describe those spiritual realities, we have to use terms that are symbolic in nature, that are attempting to describe what we intend to describe, but that could never be taken, should never be taken literally. So that's how Baha'i teachings explain the references to heaven and hell in the Holy Scriptures of other religions. They should be understood symbolically, describing states of nearness to and distance from God in this world and in the realms beyond. As I said, following this approach, Baha'u'llah argues that many philosophical and theological terms that in various religions refer to afterlife should also be reinterpreted rather as symbolic descriptions of spiritual realities. So Baha'i teachings have a unique view on heaven and hell. On the other hand, they proclaim the existence of heaven and hell. So they do not reject the idea of heaven and hell, and therefore they do not reject the idea of reward and punishment. On the other hand, spiritually speaking, they proclaim that in the long run, maybe in the very long run, everybody could be saved by the grace of God. And by doing that, Baha'i teachings also avoid a very difficult task of retaining the ideas of retribution, punishment, and reward, while rejecting the literal understanding of eternal hell. Because this is another paradox of heaven and hell. If we get rid of hell altogether and we have only heaven, So how can we equate the fate of Hitler, for example, and of Mother Teresa? It doesn't seem just. So some kind of retribution should exist, but it should not be eternal. So this is my presentation, and these are my references and further readings. And with this, I would gladly invite comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. It was fascinating. I love how you offer philosophical proofs for various positions, and I found them really quite interesting and persuasive. And I love the comparisons that you were able to make as well. It really, I think, bring out the tensions in these ideas. And it's fascinating how the Baha'i approach sort of solves these problems, and that's particularly interesting. We have someone saying, please share the link of the recording for this fantastic talk. Yes, of course, we'll be putting the PowerPoint itself and the recording up on our website. If you click on webinars, you'll be able to find the information about this particular webinar, and it's already up. We'll just simply replace the link for registration for the link with the recording, so there will be no problem at all.
Robert, I'm sorry. Should I stop sharing the screen, or should I keep sharing the screen?
Let's leave it up for now in case people have questions about specific slides. And my internet may cut out on me at any time. I'm afraid today I've got very bad internet. We don't yet have any questions. I would want to encourage people to post the questions, particularly in the Q&A, and we can also keep an eye out on the chat to find any questions that are there as well. Sandra says, this is the first time someone has been able to explain predestination to me. Thank you. And I think that was a particularly interesting point.
Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that.
Your comments on Martin Luther also were very interesting, because his depression is certainly well known. I have an interesting comment to make. You made the comment that you thought resolving the fear or the anxiety about death is one of the main purposes of religion. And of course, this has also been a criticism of religion, you might say. The accusation has been leveled that religion just simply exists to satisfy the psychological need of the fear of death. A friend of mine, however, once turned that around and said that in actual fact, the fear of judgment is worse, and that in that sense, religion doesn't help solve the psychological problem, because you still have to worry about being judged at death. So I was wondering if you have any particular comment about that.
Well, look, usually people who believe in God and follow some religion, usually they assume that God is all loving and they will end up in heaven. Generally speaking, believing in eternal hell for someone, I think this is not a healthy psychological approach. You have to believe that in the end, everyone will be saved. And therefore, religion does play its role. Of course, if you have a sense of guilt, like Martin Luther did, and you are prone to depression, then you may have serious problems.
Heather asks an interesting question about chastity and holiness. If the whole way we are created was through sex, then why should we not lime it? I'm not sure what she means by lime it. Emphasize it, accept it. I'm not sure.
Let me see. I have a question about chastity and holiness.
Maybe limit it. Something just popped up down below. Maybe
look,
like it. Why we should not like it, she says.
I don't think we dislike sex, if that's what the question is about. Let me say something about sex. Many things in religions are actually conditioned by the way the founder of the religion lived his life. So, for example, in Christianity, Jesus was never married, didn't have children. So from the very beginning, the followers of Jesus thought that the way of chastity and celibacy, so the monastic way, is the best way. Marriage is a good way, but it is not the best way. And I think that's why Christianity developed monasticism. But if we look at Judaism, one of the Jewish commandments is to be fruitful and multiply. This is extremely important for the Jews, to have family and to have children. When I was studying at Temple University, every religion was taught to us by the real representative of this religion. So Judaism was taught by a rabbi who was specializing in medieval Judaism. To my great surprise, and actually to the surprise of all of my classmates, he told us that in the medieval times, in the Middle Ages, one of the requirements for every Jew was to have a sexual intercourse with his wife daily, on a daily basis. That was a religious requirement. The only people who were excluded were the rabbis, because they had a lot of work to do. So two religions, two very different approaches to the issues of sex and family. But those different approaches, I don't think have anything to do with chastity or holiness or anything else. It's just the way religions develop. That's my sense of it.
Giti asks about Islam and noted that you did not mention Islam and its approach to the afterlife at all.
No, I did mention Islam when I was talking about Judaism. I divided Christianity from Islam and Judaism because in Christianity we're talking about bodily resurrection in a literal sense, but Jews and Muslims do not believe in the original sin, and they are more inclined toward spiritual immortality, although in some versions they also have beliefs in bodily resurrection. So this is the only reason I did not mention Islam specifically. Plus, I was realizing that my presentation would be too long, and I should concentrate on Christianity, which is the main religion of this country.
One person asks about the Mormon practice of baptizing those who've already died. Can you explain proxy baptism?
Yes, this is one of the Mormon doctrines that are very peculiar to this religion, and not the only one. According to the idea, if you know the name of the person, and if this person was not baptized, and you baptized in the name of this person, the relative, for example, is baptized in the name of this person, then this person in the afterlife will be saved and will be able to go to, not to the upper level of heaven, but at least to the second level of heaven. Mormons have a lot of controversy with this ritual because at some point they started baptizing all the victims of the Holocaust. And as we know, without actually asking permission. And as we know, Jews do not want to be baptized either while they are alive or even after they die. So therefore, the Jewish community sued Mormons. And after that, Mormons said that they will never do that again. So they only baptize those dead people whose relatives actually give permission for that.
This is, of course, why they are so interested in genealogy. And yes, when I was doing research on Thornton Chase, the first American Baha'i, I went to Salt Lake City to go through the genealogical records, and sure enough, in about half an hour, I managed to find Thornton Chase's mother's entire family and when they were born and how they were related to each other and all that. by going through the genealogical library in Salt Lake City. Now, of course, it's online, but it wasn't at that time.
Yeah, now it's online.
Yeah.
So I see Patricia is asking who is going to judge Baha'i souls when we pass on to the next level. My understanding is that God will never be met by anyone. Thanks. I have no idea. I simply have no idea. And I have not read any specific references about that. And my general position is, I think, the Baha'i position is that we do not know much about the afterlife.
Yeah.
You know, Confucius once asked about the afterlife, and his response was, I do not know much about this life. So why should I worry more about this life before I actually study the afterlife? I think Baha'i position is close to that one.
Sounds a bit like some of the Buddha's positions as well. Charlotte from YouTube asks about Swedenborg and whether she noted that he said that there was no reincarnation and that life begins in the physical world and continues in the spiritual world.
Yes, I've read Swedenborg. I know about Swedenborg because Swedenborg was the contemporary of Immanuel Kant, and Immanuel Kant actually knew him. And I believe there was one story when Immanuel Kant asked Swedenborg to connect with the dead relative and tell him where he placed one thing before he died, something like this. And Swedenborg did say the place where this thing was hidden. And Kant wrote that Swedenborg does have some kind of talent which is impossible to comprehend. So he was a very famous guy, and there is a Swedenborgian church nowadays. Swedenborg does have this teaching about life beginning in the physical world and being reborn in the spiritual world. I think that is very close to what Baha'is are taught. But he, as far as I remember, Swedenborg also believed in some kind of merging of two beings into one when we die. It's kind of a version of a soulmate. Again, I do not know. I do not know how true is that, and I have never read anything about soulmates in the Baha'i teachings.
Yeah. Swedenborgianism was very popular in the 19th century in the United States, and there were many early American Baha'is who were conversant with it. Thornton Chase even had been a member of the Swedenborgian Church in Denver in the late 1870s, early 1880s. Here's another question from the chat, and then I'll turn to the question and answer. Serene asks whether the various ideas about reincarnation all come from Hinduism.
Not Hinduism, from India. Although we know that Plato, for example, believed in reincarnation. And Cicero may have believed in reincarnation. So this idea was widespread in ancient times. But nowadays, when we study religion, we notice that all religions that come from India, whether they are polytheistic, monotheistic, non-theistic, they all teach reincarnation. So I assume that the idea of reincarnation comes from this part of the world.
Paul Mantle says, could you discuss the Baha'i view of literal physical reincarnation?
Where is that?
It's in the Q&A. That's over in the Q&A. I'm going back and forth between the two.
Okay, could you please talk a bit more on how Orthodoxy beliefs are similar to
That's
Baha'i?
The next one down.
I think, now, do you mean Greek and Russian Orthodoxy, and where did these beliefs come from? I think in terms of beliefs, Greek and Russian Orthodoxy are pretty much the same because it is Orthodoxy after all. They do not change anything. And Russian Orthodoxy comes from Greek Orthodoxy. These beliefs came from the fathers of the church, the early fathers of the church. And the difference between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and generally Orthodoxy and Western Christianity, comes from the fact that Orthodox Christianity never accepted St. Augustine and his concept of the original sin. So Orthodox Christians do not believe in the original sin. They do believe that Adam symbolizes the natural, physical nature of human beings, and Christ symbolizes the spiritual nature of human beings. It's exactly how Abdul Baha, responds to questions about the original sin. It's a metaphorical expression. Orthodox Christians the same way understand heaven and hell. Heaven and hell are symbolic states, not real places. And they are not objective states, so to say. God does not create hell. Humans create hell for themselves by not accepting God. So therefore, the symbolism of these ideas, that's where I think Orthodox Christian beliefs are close to what Baha'is believe.
Also in the Q&A, Paul asks, right above Judith's question, whether you could discuss the Baha'i view of physical reincarnation, Baha'i rejection of it.
Yes, Baha'i teaching rejects literal and physical reincarnation. Abdul Baha, in some answered questions, says that everything in life moves forward, and therefore reincarnation, meaning coming back, would be going against the general law of nature. He also provides other arguments against the literal understanding of reincarnation by saying that by reincarnation we mean the coming back of the essence of the person, while we should understand by reincarnation the coming back of the qualities of the person. So for example, when Baha'u'llah appears as the manifestation of God, it is not Christ reincarnated, it is a different human being who actually manifests or reflects the same qualities Jesus Christ did. So this is a metaphorical or symbolic reinterpretation of the idea of reincarnation.
Going back over to the chat now, Heather asks about the sin of suicide and what should people believe when many people commit suicide in their own family? Should they still view it as a sin?
Yes, most religions forbid suicide, I think, because the purpose of religion is to promote life, not death. And suicide is a form of self-murder. Most religions are against murder. I know only one religion that does not forbid suicide, which is Jainism or Jainism. According to Jainism and their stories, their founder Mahavira may have died of self-starvation, right? Basically of suicide. All other religions are against suicide in some way or another. But personally, I do not think that suicide should be regarded as a mortal sin like it is regarded in Catholicism, because there are many causes of suicide, including mental illness. If a person is mentally ill and because of that, this person commits suicide, this is not a sin. This is simply a tragedy. So it should be put into a context of a person's life. If we are talking about euthanasia, this is another controversial issue. And frankly, I do not have any definite solution to this issue. But as a person of tradition, I'm instinctively against that. Although I understand the medical reasons and arguments for doing that, when the person is in extreme pain, and the pain is so extreme that it is better to actually end it.
Yeah. Let's see. And then Heather also asks, according to the Baha'i Faith, can we be reunited with our loved ones in the next world who have committed suicide?
I do not recall any specific passages about that. I mean, I recall a lot of passages about being reunited with our loved ones, period, in the next world. Abdul Baha says that we can even have conversations, spiritual conversations with dead people in the dreams, for example. But specifically with the people who committed suicide, I do not recall any passages. So when I do not recall any specific passages, I'm inclined to think in a positive way that we may reunite with those people.
Yeah. Continuing here in the chat, Serene says, are there any specific descriptions in the Quran of heaven and hell?
As far as I know, as far as I remember, yes. I've read the Quran, but it was a long time ago. But I believe that there are some specific surahs and passages in the Quran that address the Last Judgment, because in the Muslim beliefs, and there are 6 fundamental Muslim beliefs, the belief about the Last Judgment, the apocalypse, the resurrection of the dead, is second in importance only to the belief in one God. There is one God, there is one God, one Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. That is the cornerstone of Islam. The second in importance is that, you know, there will be time when you will be judged. And those descriptions, as far as I remember, are very, very similar to what you read in the book of Revelation in the Bible. The paradise is described as the heavenly garden when people enjoy drinking wine, by the way, and the companion of young ladies. And obviously, this is a symbolic description because Muslims are forbidden to drink alcoholic beverages. The hell is described as a place of torment. Yes.
Interesting. More specifically, does Baha'u'llah have anything to say about euthanasia? And what does the Baha'i Faith also say about suicide? These are questions from one from the Q&A and one from the chat that kind of relate to each other.
Yes, and I see another one. Yeah, what I meant was, if my husband and father both committed suicide, will I see them in the next life? Look, I do not recall any passages in Baha'i Faith about euthanasia and suicide. I should look further because this is a very important issue, obviously. Again, until I see something to the contrary, I would say that if you were spiritually close to your husband and father, even if they committed suicide, you will reunite with them.
Yeah, and we even have the example of the author of the Dawnbreakers.
Exactly.
After Baha'u'llah died, throwing himself into the ocean and committing suicide because he wants to be reunited with Baha'u'llah, which is quite a drastic action of a lover wanting to be reunited with the messenger of God. Then there's a question here from an anonymous attendee over in the Q&A, a recent course that I took at the Rohr Jewish Learning Institute, which is a Hasidic one, stressed that Hasidic Jews not only believe in reincarnation, but also that the soul could be fractured with a portion of the soul being piggybacked onto another soul. This in order for that fraction of the soul to complete its unfinished mission. Do you have any further perspective on this? Do Baha'is believe that the soul can be fractured or destroyed, or that there's male and female souls, or animal souls?
So about Hasidic Judaism, these are very weird beliefs. So as far as I know, Baha'is do not believe that the soul could be destroyed. Every human being has a unique soul, and this unique soul could never turn into anything else. So this soul's evolution can be moving forward but it cannot turn into a different kind of personality or individuality. So all this is part of mental problems and psychological conditions. But spiritually speaking, souls cannot be fractured or destroyed. Now, about female and animal souls do exist, but according to Baha'i teachings, they are not eternal. And in terms of the female souls, I do not recall Abdul Baha talking about female souls and male souls. When he's talking about souls, this is unisex.
Yeah,
that's the description.
Yeah, that's my understanding also. And it was something else here that occurred to me, that Abdul Baha even describes the soul as being uncomposed. In other words, if something is composed like the human body, you can't keep it together forever because the connections can't be maintained forever. It's complex, it'll fall apart. But the human soul being uncomposed, it's immortal and eternal because it can't decay. It's like a single atom in that sense.
Yeah.
That's my understanding anyway.
I see another question. Why is money a common thread in religion historically and currently? Why not share monies from different religions to all? Thanks. Look, money is the foundation of existence in this material world. Without money, you cannot exist. And sharing money to all will result in universal poverty. That is my socialist Soviet experience.
Yeah.
This is the greatest disadvantage of socialism. You do not share money, you share poverty, because humans will work only for their personal rewards. They will not work for rewards for everybody. That's why capitalism is working better in economics. It has its own disadvantages. Doing profitable work is very good, but everyone would prefer doing those charitable works by themselves, not collectively.
I think we're out of questions. I don't see any more. And again, my internet may be unstable, so I'm a little concerned that I might suddenly disappear here. But I don't see any other questions. So perhaps this is a good time to wrap up our program for today. And I want to thank you again, Mikhail, for a fascinating and very insightful and creative approach to this particular topic. And I think that everyone will benefit very much watching this video later on. It should be, I think, quite popular. I want to again thank our audience for joining us today.